about 2 more minutes just to see if we can get a couple more participants who were expected to call in. Sorry for the short delay on our side. We had some technical difficulties, but we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being patient with us. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm sure some other members will join us as we start to get going. And just so everybody knows, the session is being recorded, so if your colleagues were not able to participate today, this will go out for others to be able to listen in. So today is our third webinar during this Protection Strategy Guest Speaker Series. And so we'll be introducing our new guest speaker soon. But I just wanted to give a bit of a background about what we're doing and what this whole series is about.
But first, just a little bit of background. Your microphones are muted, but if you have any questions or comments for either Jessica or our panelists, please feel free to write in a question or your comment, and I can bring it to their attention. And then we'll have some time at the end for some discussion. So if you have questions throughout, please feel free to add your questions in throughout, but then we'll also leave some time at the end.
So welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica Lenz. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Protection here at Interaction, and I lead on the Results-Based Protection Program. And I'm accompanied here today by Eileen McCarthy, who's our Program Coordinator. And so we're going to talk to you a little bit about what we've been doing on results-based protection, a little bit of background, and some information about this guest speaker series. Our program is funded by ECHO and USAID OFDA. So the objectives for our review of looking at protection strategies is to review whether current approaches to protection strategies support a results-based approach to protection, and to identify the critical components within a protection strategy that support a results-based approach to protection. By the end of this, it's about a month or so, or maybe almost 2 months that we've been doing a review. We expect to have a summary and an analysis paper that will be distributed widely so that others can see the findings in terms of what we've identified. And we will use that summary and analysis in the findings to inform our next in-country roundtable, which will be taking place in August. So we've had a series of guest speakers so far, and we have a couple more coming up over the next 2 weeks. So last Wednesday, well actually last Monday, I kicked off the session with a preliminary findings of our interviews that we had over the course of 2 weeks, where we interviewed NGOs and ProCaps and basically indicated some of the key things that were coming out of those interviews. And then the guest speaker series, which started last Wednesday, included a colleague from Nonviolence Peace Force, Leah Kreventian, I can never say her name right, sorry, from South Sudan, and she spoke to us about protection strategies building from the ground up. Today we are here with Kate Rougvie, who's the former GBV and Protection Sector Advisor and GBV Subcluster Coordinator in the Central African Republic. Later this week on Friday, we will be speaking to Caroline Masongi, Protection and GBV Specialist from the Danish Refugee Council in Lebanon. And then next week, on Thursday of next week, we'll be speaking to Louise Obam, who is the Global Protection Cluster Coordinator. So this is the series that we have going on. So just to give a bit of a background before we completely get started, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean by results-based protection. So results-based protection refers to results as the measurable components of an intervention that contribute to and include the outcome or impact, intended or unintended, positive or negative, of the response. So the outcome is measured in terms of reduced risk. And also, given that this series is about protection strategy, let's make sure that we all are on the same page, at least for this point, in terms of what is a protection strategy. So it refers to a combination of efforts, often involving multiple actors and sectors, to bring about a desired protection outcome. A strategy is larger than a program. It should inform and be informed by a comprehensive set of efforts working towards a common desired outcome. So what is strategic planning for protection? This is the process of articulating the desired protection outcome or outcomes, articulating the pathway or causal logic to achieve it, setting out clearly defined corresponding objectives and indicators, and describing the complementary roles of actors and contributing to the desired outcome. So protection strategy supporting a results-based approach to protection. And let's introduce our guest speaker today. So welcome, Kate. Thank you for joining us. Kate most recently spent 15 months in the CAR, where she led the GBV and Protection Department for an NGO and co-coordinating the National GBV Subcluster. Kate has also worked with INGOs and the UN on GBV, gender and child protection in countries such as South Sudan, Liberia, DRC, and Jordan. Currently based in Brisbane, Australia, Kate is a Rotary International Peace Fellow studying for Masters of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Queensland. So welcome, Kate. We're really glad to have you here today.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me with you today. This is such a great topic. And I'm really excited to have a chance to share some of my experiences from Central African Republic. And it's great that we have this chance to discuss those and to learn from them. Great.
We're excited to have you here today too. And for those of you on the line, as you know, we've been talking about protection strategies at a broad sense. And as you can see, Kate specializes in GBV, so she will be bringing in the perspective of looking at protection strategies through a GBV lens. So much of our discussion will probably focus on GBV, although a lot of the issues that she will probably raise and some of the thinking around improving protection strategies or GBV strategies apply across the board for protection actors. So let's go ahead and get started. We have some cool pictures of Kate as well up here that we can put up on the screen. But I just wanted to just start us off, Kate, if you could share with us some of your experience on what current approaches look like right now when developing a protection strategy.
Sure. So, I mean, as you mentioned, my most recent experience has been very much through the cluster system. So, I'm going to come at this from a GBV subcluster feeding into protection cluster standpoint. In terms of current approaches, in the CAR, the GBV strategy fed into the protection cluster strategy in a reduced form. I'll talk, I think, a little bit later about the GBV strategy in itself. So in that we had, I think, around 6 strategic objectives with, I don't know, five or six results per objective, with 1 objective each for the gender-based violence and the child protection subclusters, and then other objectives covered issues such as reducing protection risks more generally, supporting IDP returns, state capacity building, these kind of issues. There were actually a number of different strategies developed in the CAR by the protection cluster. So aside from that overarching protection strategy, we also had a strategy to support the return of internally displaced persons. There was a strategy to support populations at risk. So there was a lot going on in terms of strategizing. These strategies, or at least the overarching strategy, fed into an action plan, which obviously had more detail on the kinds of individual interventions that we were planning to take. I'm not sure that there was always a really clear difference between the strategy and the action plan, so perhaps that's something we can also take away. In terms of engagement in strategy development, it was a consultative process, but in terms of technical capacity amongst local partners, this was acutely lacking. So engagement was there, but it wasn't always as meaningful as it could have been. In the case of the GBV subcluster, engagement with local partners was definitely an issue. For much the same reasons, and also limited engagement from other clusters and sectors, which is obviously particularly important given the multisectoral and cross-cutting nature of gender-based violence. I would say generally in the CAR, short deadlines did tend to characterize strategizing. Which I guess would lead to some tendency towards a bit of a top-down approach based on those timelines. And I think while protection cluster objectives were based to a large extent on viable data, I think in the early stages of the emergency, obtaining good quantitative or qualitative data was really challenging, given that we had a reasonably poor coverage in the outside of the capital in the country. So I would say that some of the objectives were based on assumptions based on information that we had gathered from the capital city at that point. But also based on viable assumptions such as that of assuming that sexual violence is taking place, as we know that it does in conflict situations. In terms of the feeding into the protection cluster strategy process from the point of view of the gender-based violence subcluster, inevitably it resulted in the reduction of the GBV strategy in terms of inputs. So I guess there was a tendency to merge a number of objectives into one kind of larger, probably slightly more vague objective, because of this desire to make sure that all of those bases are covered. So we would have the opportunity to feed in those objectives, but they weren't always necessarily as clear or perhaps as fundable as they could have been, because of the small space allocated to the subclusters within that overarching protection cluster strategy. That said, final products were always available for review by protection cluster members, but again, normally with reasonably short deadlines that meant that we would have perhaps 24 or 48 hours to submit inputs, which again doesn't perhaps lead or allow for sufficient time to make sure that it's the best quality possible.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially in terms of looking at deadlines and even the confusion from the start and whether or not it was a protection strategy that you were developing or an action plan. I'm wondering if we can build on that a little bit. So our findings actually from our interviews have kind of pointed to the fact that there is much confusion about what a protection strategy is, and therefore from the start it leads to already a misunderstanding and an inability to engage. And you kind of mentioned that a little bit already. In your view, are there steps you might take that could make the process of developing a protection strategy more effective from the beginning?
Sure, yeah, no, definitely. And I think one of the things that would stand out first and foremost for me, if we're looking at the development of strategies through the cluster system, is making sure that we have a serious investment in resources, particularly for the subclusters. I think overall strategy development, it's something that takes time. It needs serious engagement. It needs human, technical, financial, logistical resources. And I think above everything, we need to make sure that there's a commitment from the persons, from partners, from lead agencies, from those responsible to making sure that that those resources are available, so that we don't set ourselves up for failure from the beginning. In terms of commitment or engagement from key stakeholders, I think this is also really key, especially in the case of gender-based violence, where you tend to have less actors working specifically in that area. You tend to have less specific technical expertise in that area than perhaps people working more generally in protection. So the need for buy-in and participation in those processes by strategic decision makers within lead organizations and lead agencies in gender-based violence is really crucial. And I remember in CAR, following the initial surge of emergency response teams and technical advisors and such like from lead organizations, following that surge, when people would come for a few weeks or a month or so, there was a significant dip in engagement or in the participation of those strategic decision makers within those organizations after that. So I would say as well that participation allows us to make sure that we have an effective strategic advisory group or strategic working group within the subcluster itself, to oversee those the running of those processes, so that doesn't, those kind of things, those decisions don't fall constantly on the same small group of people or on the coordinator themselves of the subcluster. I think also it's crucial to remember that we need to keep survivors at the center of strategy development. And I think that hasty development of strategies can lead to actions that don't truly reflect needs. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of pressure in terms of deadlines, and I think that it's really a poor excuse for producing products of poor quality, and realistic timelines in terms of the time and again resources that it takes to develop these strategies is also key from the start. I think, again, in terms of realistic timelines, we need to allow for assessment. We need to allow for meaningful consultation. We need for partners and for lead agencies to commit the resources that are necessary for that process. And in terms of capacity, that's definitely something that needs to be strengthened in order to foster that kind of meaningful engagement from all partners. In the CAR, again, technical capacity was really low, both in terms of the strategic process itself and in terms of sectoral expertise. So again, in country, we didn't have a lot of people for a lot of the time I was there who were GBV specialists, for example. Obviously, in emergency settings, time is precious and resources are thin. So in terms of capacity building, I'd probably say that deploying frequent, short, focused capacity building exercises rather than trying to carry out elaborate 1 week, 2 week training sessions can really serve to get everybody on the same page, to be using the same terminology, both in terms, again, of the strategy development process itself and in terms of the technical terminology. It also allows for covering the basics of guiding principles of safety, ethics, and confidentiality, safe and ethical information management, and security for survivors. And I think through that kind of an approach, it can be less daunting, it can be much easier to implement, and can lead to more meaningful participation, particularly by local partners. I think included within that as well, prior to starting a strategy development process, is capacity building on GBV prevention and response models, which would then put us in a much better position to identify needs and gaps. So in terms of needs assessment in itself, I think it's really important that objectives reflect a thorough analysis of risks and vulnerabilities and needs and gaps. And in CAR, accessing information was really challenging. When I arrived in the CAR in mid to late 2013, there was almost no existing literature, especially not at the time of the L2 to L3 emergency. There were painfully few actors in the country working on GBV. Extremely few actors outside of the capital city and few in the capital itself. So you can imagine that getting hold of any background information was quite an undertaking. Again, I think in CAR we suffered to a large extent from a lack of coordination resources. And one of the things I would take away from that experience is that when assessments are undertaken, that follow up to compile reports and to disseminate reports where it's appropriate is so important, or it can lead to clearly a waste of time and a degree of disillusionment amongst subcluster partners who have dedicated resources to that. In terms of budgeting, I think one of the things I would consider key in the process is advocating for all partners to integrate assessment costs into project proposal budgets. Again, I'm coming back to the question of resources to carry out assessment, but it's something that I felt was often overlooked in the CAR. And especially given the need for attention to assessment and monitoring of strategic plans once they're produced, and recognizing that that whole process is cyclical and ongoing. In terms of the GBV strategy development, I think that engagement with other sectors is really important. I think ensuring good coordination with other sectors or other clusters, it's crucial to increasing understanding of different sectoral roles and responsibilities vis-a-vis GBV prevention and response initiatives. So, I mean, for example, in the CAR, we met a lot with the health cluster, for example, to share understandings of minimum standards for GBV in emergencies, and making sure that those minimum standards, or that common understanding, was also integrated into their and into other clusters' assessment processes. So that assessment data doesn't have to only come from the GBV subcluster itself. In terms of indicators, again, need to be linked to real needs, need to be realistic, measurable, achievable, and they also need, and I suppose this is quite specific to GBV, but they need to be based on a shared understanding of how we evaluate needs. So, for example, in the beginning of the onset of an emergency, we would be looking to evaluate the number of services that are available or not available to provide life-saving assistance to survivors, not the number of survivors. We can assume safely that in a conflict situation the risk of sexual assault is extremely high. Or we might be looking at measuring a percentage increase in access, or in survivors accessing services, as a reflection of the quality of the services that we've managed to put into place. So it's, for me, I think a little bit about changing that mentality of what it is we're looking to measure and what reflects progress. I think also empowering partners through a clear division of labor is really important, including local partners, and ensuring that monitoring and evaluation tasks are included in that plan as well. I think sometimes we create the plans and we applaud ourselves for having created a plan, but there's not quite enough commitment to an ongoing review of how we're progressing, so that we can flag challenges before they grow too large. And perhaps before embarking on the strategy development, we might want to look at carrying out some kind of pre-testing or evaluation on existing understanding amongst the subcluster partners on strategy development and on technical aspects of GBV. So pre-strategy, we'd be able to identify what our capacity building needs are, come in with a sharp and focused capacity building plan before embarking upon a strategy development process. And I think that would really increase the degree of meaningful participation by all partners.
Well, thank you. There's a lot of good points and steps in here that you spoke about in terms of really trying to start from the very beginning in terms of improving the entire process. A little bit more on the process, I guess. One thing of our findings that we found that was needed is that there was a need for dedicated coordination to support strategic planning for protection. And we know that you served as the co-chair of the GBV subcluster in CAR, and also took on the role of the GBV advisor for Mercy Corps. So given this dual hat that you wore, can you talk about what steps need to be taken to ensure there's a right balance, or that coordinators can be fully dedicated? And how can dedicated support help to achieve protection outcomes?
This is a great question, thank you. It's something that's really important to take into account, and I know that I've already touched briefly on the need for resourcing. But I think that there needs to be a greater recognition of just how huge a job it is to coordinate the subcluster. It definitely requires full-time, dedicated interagency staffing and engagement from multiple stakeholders. It's definitely best when it's a team effort. In terms of the situation in the CAR, it was a really difficult situation. At the onset of the L3 emergency, there was no subcluster coordinator in place. So as Mercy Corps had been providing a co-lead for several months prior to that, they stepped up and they filled a crucial gap. So for that period, I worked both as subcluster coordinator and led Mercy Corps' GBV and protection department. So so two big roles. I was very fortunate in the first few months, or the first few weeks, I should say, following the onset of the emergency, in that I had support from the GBV AOR through the rapid response team. And that made a huge difference to what we were able to do, but also reflects again on the fact that it is definitely not a one-person job or a person who is double-hatting with other jobs job. And I know we hear it a lot, but I do have to say, I think in emergencies, coordination can absolutely save lives. And it's not just about sitting down for a weekly meeting. You're looking at development and maintenance of information management systems, establishment and constant updating and dissemination of referral pathways, establishing 3Ws, tracking 3Ws, disseminating that information again, and ongoing engagement with the intercluster, ongoing integration of GBV across all other sectors and building relationships with those sectors, capacity building that we've already touched on as well, and generally ensuring that ethical practice is employed by everybody all the time. So just to mention a few of the jobs associated with the subcluster coordination that are crucial for developing effective strategic plans. So I would say, I mean, my bottom line with that is that it's pretty much impossible to get it right without without adequate resourcing. So I would say there definitely needs to be a fulfilling of responsibilities by lead agencies of clusters and subclusters to provide full-time, dedicated interagency coordinators with appropriate technical skill sets as soon as possible after an emergency. I would also say there should perhaps be greater accountability mechanisms to ensure that that happens within humanitarian cluster systems. I think we also need to limit turnover amongst coordinators to ensure that that momentum that we build and the relationships that we build that are so crucial to the GBV coordination aren't lost when people come and go. I think also, I mean, I mentioned that I think we really require full-time dedicated interagency coordinators, and I stress again the need for those to be interagency. And I do think that during development of strategies, if it's not 100% clear that a coordinator is interagency, it can create some degree of confusion as to whether the subcluster coordinator is representing the subcluster, if they are representing the agency by whom they're employed. That kind of interagency nature is really important in that respect. I would also say, again, in terms of resources and dedicated coordinators, there also needs to be an investment in support staff for jobs associated with information management, for example. We know that without up-to-date information, which is in itself extremely time-consuming to achieve, I touched already on the question of constantly updating referral pathways, constantly updating 3Ws, and that's just a small part of the kind of information management that needs to happen. Yes, it's time-consuming to achieve, but it's crucial in ensuring that our strategies reflect needs and respond to changes in needs. So I think a greater investment in that aspect of the coordination team, if you like, would make a really big difference to the way in which we achieve results. And I will take the opportunity as well to add a point on funding for co-leads or co-coordinators. So the NGO counterpart to the UN lead agency for the subclusters. It's really important that this role is filled as well. And in CAR, this was a really tricky one. I mean, despite Mercy Corps' best efforts, we really struggled to find a donor willing to fund a full-time co-lead. So perhaps that reflects a need to raise awareness amongst donors of the importance of that role. And also, it's a time at which the protection cluster and the cluster system hierarchy in general can stand up to advocate for those roles to be funded as well.
Thank you. That was really interesting, especially in the importance of the funding for both the dedicated coordinator, but also the co-coordinator that's oftentimes coming from the NGO world. Wondering if we can switch a little bit and talk a little bit about the need for a multisectoral approach to a response. And what we know currently through our results-based protection work is that a results-based approach requires that we take a diverse and multisectoral approach to the response. And this means that we also need to understand the contribution from different actors. How do we improve the coordination between the protection cluster and the subclusters like GBV or child protection so that we do not find ourselves working in silos and duplicating efforts? What steps are needed to engage actors outside the protection community to contribute towards the achievement of protection outcomes?
Okay, yeah, I think it's a really pertinent issue in the case of gender-based violence coordination in particular. Again, given just how multisectoral it is and how much of a cross-cutting issue it represents. Starting with the question of, let's say, the relationship between the subclusters and the protection cluster, I do think that the independence, or the degree of independence that the subclusters have from the protection cluster allows them a very valuable autonomy over the way that strategy is developed and freedom from any kind of imposition. So I definitely think that's a positive aspect of a distance between the two entities. At the same time, I touched on before the question of feeding GBV subcluster strategic objectives into an overarching protection cluster strategy, which I think can lead to a bit of if you like, a kitchen sink approach where everything kind of gets thrown into one objective because we don't want to miss anything out. So choosing which objectives to pick out of a GBV subcluster strategy that's already been ideally well thought through and well prioritized can result in a bit of an arbitrary further prioritization of those objectives, which can lead to something that's a bit vague and perhaps a bit harder to fund as well. In terms of duplication of efforts, if we're talking about the issue of subclusters and the protection cluster working in silos, I would say in my experience in CAR, duplication wasn't a huge issue. The role of the GBV subcluster was quite clear. I think that people generally had their hands very full, and honestly, it probably would have been nice to have more actors taking on GBV prevention and response roles. But in that case, that generally it was quite clear what was the responsibility of GBV subcluster. I would say that while I felt that there was a great degree of cohesion and collaboration between the gender-based violence and the child protection subclusters, I think that the relationship, at least initially, between the GBV subcluster and the protection cluster was a little bit more difficult, and I think there's definitely a need for that communication to be a two-way street. the subcluster absolutely needs the protection cluster to advocate for it, to amplify its voice. It can be hard to push through issues given that there's that extra layer between the subclusters and the intercluster, for example. And just making sure that the protection cluster is involving itself in a participatory fashion in the development of strategies, in meetings, and not just through updates from the subcluster in protection cluster meetings. In terms of engaging other sectors, as I said, this is particularly relevant for GBV prevention and response program, given the degree of cross-pollination that we really need for effective GBV prevention and response. GBV, I think, ultimately isn't a sector; it's a cross-cutting issue, and I, obviously can't repeat enough the fact that all humanitarian actors have a clear responsibility to take steps within their programming, within their coordination, to prevent gender-based violence. I found that in the CAR in particular, there was still a reasonably limited awareness of the roles and responsibilities of other sectors, of other clusters, including general knowledge and awareness of EASC guidelines for GBV in emergencies and those checklists. So again, the subcluster really needs that support and cohesion with the protection cluster in cases where it is struggling to build that recognition of the responsibility of other sectors to take on those roles. I would say that in terms of engagement, building relationships with the coordination of other clusters is absolutely crucial from the outset. It's another reason, again, why turnover within the coordination can be so damaging, because those relationships take so long to build, but can be really fruitful if built well. So yeah, building relationships across those sectoral divides, whether it be through informal bilateral meetings between GBV subcluster coordination and the coordination of other clusters, through the dissemination of literature such as the EASC checklists that we had kind of put together into a really accessible one-pager reminder per sector that we disseminated directly to the coordination of those clusters. We disseminated through the intercluster and through the protection cluster. So again, we can see the value of having that support from the protection cluster to endorse that. It can be through the establishment of focal points from participants or members of the GBV subcluster who go to participate in other sectors, or through briefings during the meeting of other sectors, and also I think through making it clear that the GBV subcluster is there to have a look at the strategies of other sectors, to make suggestions and recommendations on how they can mainstream cross-cutting protection and GBV issues in their strategies too. So again, the protection cluster and the intercluster represent useful vehicles for supporting that and advocating for the GBV subcluster.
Oh, great. Our findings show that it's unclear how protection issues and actions to respond to those issues are actually prioritized within a protection strategy. It appears that in most of the cases, what drives the prioritization of the strategic response is actually based on what actors are already doing, or where funding is available, and even sometimes in terms of where an agency has a particular mandate. But priorities are not based on context-specific analysis and real problem solving. Given the various limitations like timing, resources, staffing, etc., what opportunities or examples might we build on to improve how protection issues are prioritized within a protection strategy?
Okay. Yes, it does sound somewhat familiar. Prioritization of needs. Well, obviously, and again, the bottom line is that needs prioritization of needs should be based on good information to begin with, and on a thorough analysis of gaps. And I think in terms of gender-based violence, one of the big issues, if you like, that we have, not so much in the prioritization, if I take it back a step, in terms of how we evaluate what needs are, is looking at what kind of data we seek to collect, and why it matters, and how we identify those needs before we prioritize them. So I think, firstly, I would say, yeah, there's a definite need to raise awareness of the meaning and use of quantitative data in gender-based violence assessment, first of all. In that, I think I may have mentioned this earlier, but in emergencies, we can safely assume that sexual violence takes place. And what we really need in those initial stages of the emergency is data on the availability and the quality of services that can offer life-saving support to survivors of sexual assault in particular. So we're looking at service availability, we're looking at security risks and vulnerabilities. What we're not looking for at that stage is data to tell us how many women have been raped. It's not a question that we can answer. It's not a question that is useful to answer at that point. What we can and what we should be doing is working on the assumption that that is indeed the case, and then looking at the best way, the most appropriate way to ensure that those survivors are able to safely and confidentially access appropriate and capable services. So there, what I'm saying is we want to shift the focus perhaps onto qualitative data in those stages, or quantitative data with regards to mapping of services, but not quantitative data in terms of GBV cases. Again, in terms of coming back to the need to prioritize based on good information, we definitely need more gender disaggregated and age disaggregated data, which, as we know, can tell us a lot, can indicate risks to us, can therefore inform the way in which we choose to respond. And I found that in the CAR, a lot of the data that was coming out of a number of sectors that would have been extremely useful, data regarding headcounts of internally displaced persons, for example, across the country, was very seldom disaggregated by sex or age. So that was definitely a big gap, and definitely something that could have assisted us in making better choices in prioritizing needs. What else was I going to say? So again, not to hark on too much about data issues, but just to touch on the question of the role of the gender-based violence information management system as well. I think that there is perhaps still a limited awareness as to the meaning of the GBV-IMS and the purpose that it serves within the humanitarian coordination and definitely amongst donors. As we know, the GBV-IMS is a tool that can help service providers to improve the quality of the case management and the services that they're providing. And it's in these settings, it's certainly not to provide prevalence data. It's not there to tell us how many cases there are and where they are, etc. It is often misunderstood as such. So I think that discussion and briefings very early on in an emergency, or indeed when sort of at the moment of the rollout of the GBV IMS in the country, they're making sure that the humanitarian coordination is fully aware of the purposes that serves can save a lot of time later in the game when we're looking at gathering information related to needs and prioritizing those needs. I think also that going back again to capacity building and the need to increase understanding of both technical aspects of GBV and models, I think that targeted capacity building for partners could make sure that that consultation process is more meaningful. Obviously, it should be a participatory process. It normally is a consultative process, but whether that participation really is meaningful is still questionable, I think. So, making sure that there are interventions that address the need for partners to better understand what we look for when we are looking to plan interventions, and what we consider to be the most important, or perhaps the interventions that are immediately life-saving. I mean, in CAR, I suppose we had the issue of even though we had few actors, we had a number of actors that would play very specific roles within GBV prevention and response programming. Again, being such a multisectoral field, we have actors from security, from justice sector, from the medical sector, from social, from mental health and psychosocial sectors. So it's not unusual that certain organizations want to prioritize the issues on which they work. So that's definitely one of the challenges that we worked to overcome. And I think in CAR we were able to look at how we could integrate those kinds of services so that we didn't have to pick and choose one over the next. But yes, coming back to the initial question, we know that strategy should be needs-based, not based on existing resources. In CAR, this was really challenging because of the acute lack of actors and funding. So, we would look at what we wanted to achieve. We would look at how many people are actually available to implement that, and what kind of range of actors were participating, and it would seem like an impossible challenge to achieve the kind of work that we felt was needed. But I think that this should absolutely serve as a basis for advocacy, and not as a deterrent to including certain interventions as objectives. I can remember in CAR at the time of one particular strategy development, I think only around 10% of the counties in the country had any kind of GBV actor or service available. Now, at that point, aiming to install services in every single county in the country could have been perceived as unrealistic, would have been very difficult to attract funding for, despite the clear need to establish those services in every county. So we based our coverage goals, if you like, on information coming from the protection cluster, which showed us which areas, which counties in the country were most acutely affected by the conflict, either through indicators such as for example, the presence or the prevalence of non-state armed groups within certain counties. So it wasn't a perfect system, but it helped us to triangulate that information to be able to come out with more realistic goals. But again, in terms of making sure that even when we have carried out a prioritization process, recognizing that those priorities can change. Certainly in the context of CAR, the context itself changed constantly and often very quickly, and making sure that we have those M&E systems and mechanisms in place to ensure that there is a cyclical kind of feeding back into that strategy and a reevaluation periodically of those priorities is also really important, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just looking at the time, and I know we're coming towards the end, and I know we started a little late, so I just want to ask one kind of final wrap-up question, and then maybe we'll have a little time to try to see if we can get one or two questions in, maybe. But just to kind of wrap it up, Kate, what would you then think, given your experience in working with protection strategies, what do you think the critical components within a protection strategy should be to achieve protection outcomes?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? In terms of process, I think that, again, in the case of gender-based violence prevention and response and coordination in particular, we need to invest in how we understand needs and how the humanitarian community understands needs related to GBV and to GBV survivors. I think our assessment needs to be ethical, especially when we're looking at assessment around gender-based violence. It needs to be safe and ethical and carried out by people who are aware of GBV guiding principles, and it needs to foster participation of the community where it's appropriate in terms of gender-based violence. Coming back to the issue of understanding what we mean by needs, in terms of gender-based violence, one case of rape is one too many, and we don't need to look for more. We need to shift our attention to analyzing needs in terms of availability of service delivery, quality of service delivery, access to those services, and so on and so forth. Meaningful consultation and capacity building of partners to empower them to get to a point where they can participate meaningfully, so that we step away from that kind of tokenistic participation that we tend to foster in some contexts. I also think that the promoting accountability through clear divisions of labor can encourage partners, members of the subcluster and the cluster to take full responsibility for that, and again, making sure that monitoring and evaluation plans are in place to track progress, and to hold actors accountable to what they have committed to. Again, engagement with other sectors in the case of gender-based violence prevention and response is absolutely crucial in building those relationships to ensure that other sectors include those cross-cutting protection outcomes as well. I think it's really important that we focus not only on our protection strategy, but that we make sure that we cross-pollinate as much as possible and encourage others to integrate those cross-cutting issues in their strategies as well, and be there to assist them or support them where necessary to do that. And finally, again, resources, ensuring that we have the time, that we give ourselves the time, that we have the people, that we have the financial and technical resources available to us. I think without that, we're putting ourselves in a really challenging situation, and I think it's got to be one of the biggest critical components in terms of process, without which we risk letting down the people that we're there to serve in the first place.
Thank you, Kate. I think this was a really rich discussion, and you gave a lot of really good points, especially forward thinking and suggestions, and really how to improve the development of protection strategies or GBV strategies. I want to take this time, I know we're right about at time, but I do want to open it up to see if there are any questions from members who've been participating, just to see if we can take one or two before we completely close out.
We don't have any questions at the moment, but if you all on the line do have questions or comments that you want to feed in, you can add them into the question and answer box, and I can bring them up to Kate and Jessica.
Just give us 1 minute. Oh, do we have one?
We have one.
Great.
So one of our participants said, you very helpfully emphasize the importance of including sufficient resources for assessment in proposals. But is assessment enough? Do we need broader or larger investment in analysis, particularly to understand behaviors and motivations of actors responsible for GBV in order to change these behaviors?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that we definitely need to invest more in analyzing social norms, in ensuring that, especially the ways in which we implement prevention strategies are informed by really comprehensive analysis of the context. Now, whether that's feasible in the very early stages of the emergency would depend very much on the context, obviously. I would say in the car context, even had we had that kind of that kind of funding available in the initial months, I would doubt that security would have been particularly conducive to it, or that we'd have had actors in country able to take that on. However, looking medium term to long term, I think it's a great point. I think it's absolutely something that we should be investing more on. I think that obviously not across the board, but a number of NGOs, international NGOs in particular, when designing proposals looking for funding, will include tokenistic kind of budgeting for perhaps midterm evaluations, final evaluations, and assessments, but generally speaking, they're not perhaps as in-depth or as well thought out as they should be. So I would say yes, absolutely, there needs to be a greater investment in a better understanding and a deeper analysis of the context-specific root causes and contributory factors to gender-based violence in a given context. And I think investment in that would absolutely support the more effective development of strategies, particularly strategies when we're looking at perhaps information education communication materials, behavior change communication materials. That kind of information is really crucial to make sure that they work. So yeah, thank you. Great question.
Great. Any others?
Not at the moment. Oh, we have another one. GBV, which is widespread and systemic, really seems to demand significant campaigning at a national level, public communications, and coordinated responses by all sectors. This would seem to demand HCT engagement. Do you get this kind of HCT engagement?
Sorry, can you repeat just the last part?
Yeah.
When you referred to the HCT the first time, sorry?
So to address the national campaigning and public communications and coordinated responses, this would seem to demand HCT engagement. Is this something that you see?
Okay. From my experience in the CAR, I would say generally not. Largely, any kind of dialogue between the GBV subcluster and the HCT would take place through the protection cluster coordination. So in terms of direct support from the HCT towards GBV actors, again, we relied really heavily on protection cluster coordination to advocate on our behalf and to push things up to that level if we felt that needed to be done. I can say that in CAR, on a couple of different issues with which we were grappling, we definitely had the attention of the senior humanitarian coordinator. But in terms of the HCT, I think perhaps that direct line of communication was lacking somewhat.
Great. So we have one more question. How do you know when a strategy has been successful?
It's another $1 million question. Thank you. Yeah, really good question. Well, I think, again, it depends on the needs that we've prioritized and the indicators that we've set for ourselves, and it depends on the kind of ongoing monitoring and evaluation and progress assessment that we have managed to carry out on the basis of that strategy. So generally our indicators should be designed to tell us when we have achieved progress on the objectives and the specific actions that we've set for ourselves. I think that in gender-based violence programming, and particularly if we're looking at initiatives that seek to change negative attitudes and behaviors, impact assessment is something that is challenging in emergency contexts in particular, and perhaps a little lacking across the board generally. So I would say that that making sure that, again, that we invest in carrying out that ongoing M&E, and making sure that we are able to look at long-term impact, excuse me, is really crucial. I think there's still a tendency within the humanitarian coordination community, if you like, to look at progress in terms of prevalence. And again, I've touched on it a couple of times already, this tendency to look at case numbers and to assume that a reduction in case numbers means a reduction in the problem. This is definitely something that we have to keep repeating, that we need to raise understanding of. And I think if we're looking in the short term, I would judge success based on the extent to which qualified, capable, accessible, life-saving services are available to GBV survivors. And I would take an increase in cases reporting to those services as an indication of the quality of the service, and of an awareness of the availability and the significance of the service.
Great. So we are out of time, so unfortunately, if there are any additional questions, they can be brought into our discussion forum that's online that you can participate in still. So I just wanted to say, again, thank you, Kate, for engaging with us. But for those that are on the line, just so that you can still get involved, so the discussion doesn't have to end today, I just want to let you know, or I'll turn it over to Eileen to let you know specifically about some of the different processes to get involved.
Great. So we have an online discussion forum that's been going for about 2 weeks now, and it'll go through June 12th. You can register online at our Results-Based Protection online platform, and I'll make sure that you're added to the group so you get those messages and can participate. Also, we send out kind of intermittent updates on the work of the Results-Based Protection program, and some of the links that we find to Results-Based Protection, so you can sign up to get those updates straight to your inbox on our homepage. Thanks. We have some additional webinars for our guest speaker series. So on Friday, we'll have Caroline, who's from Lebanon, and you can register the same way you did for this one. And then next Thursday, we'll have Louise Aubin from the Global Protection Cluster here as kind of our final webinar in our series.
So really, again, thank you so much, Kate, for participating today and really some helpful information that you provided. I wonder, before we completely close, if you have a specific question that you would want to throw out there to the community, those that are participating on the online discussion, or just for those that are listening to this webinar series, is there a particular question that you want to pose to us that we should think through a little bit more in terms of trying to achieve protection outcomes and improving protection strategies?
Sure. So I think, and I know I've talked a lot about the need for engagement with other sectors, and that cross-pollination, that integration of the cross-cutting issues within protection and gender-based violence interventions. So I guess given the range of technical capacities and different agendas and different levels of engagement that we experience within the humanitarian community in an emergency setting, how can we better promote joint strategic thinking across those differences? And all the while, how can we do that while keeping the survivor at the center of our process?
Great. So we will bring that question into the discussion forum, and then hopefully we can get some other responses from people out there. Again, really want to thank everybody for participating today, and especially Kate, and we'll be in touch shortly with a recording of this being sent out a little bit more broadly to different folks who weren't able to participate. So thanks again, Kate, and I know it's really late your time, so thanks for staying up as well.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Talk to everybody soon. Bye-bye.